This morning I did some TRE, trauma release exercise, and then after I was done, I was laying there, and so I decided, or it occurred to me to try to do a back bend to just lift myself up backwards. And I remember trying maybe a year ago or something, and I couldn't do it. Whereas I could do it 2 years ago when I was in manic consciousness, and I was on the slimmer side as well. When I tried a year ago, I tried to lift myself up and I couldn't. And so I tried this morning and I totally could, and I will insert the picture here. So yeah, talk about power poses. Amy Cuddy talks about power poses. I wonder if she studied the back bend. How many people can do one? I couldn't even do one when I was a kid. So it just goes to show that as the ego loses its hold, as consciousness is freed up from matter, from gravity, from being inflexible, it becomes more flexible. The body becomes more flexible and it becomes stronger too. Our own thoughts weaken our body. I watched a clip by Neil Hilborn, and it's a 3-minute clip of him using the spoken word, and it's sort of like bipolar poetry, and he's talking about bipolar and different aspects of it. And he talks about how he's seen the future and different things like that. And it's quite good. But really, many of the things he said are kind of delusional if you think about it. He says he's seen the future. What is he talking about? Whereas a person that has experienced trans consciousness, bipolar consciousness, map consciousness, has seen the future in a way, because consciousness is non-local. It can kind of go anywhere when it is freed up from the matter of the brain, from the circuits of the brain, from the ego scar tissue. And it was also interesting about, he talked about how he sees the future kind of like gravity, where we're all coming together as one. And it's interesting that he talks about gravity, because I've felt some kind of change in gravity in the process. And I feel like there's a change in the center of gravity, there's a change in the center of consciousness, and this is part of this co-creative process that's unfolding. And in a way, I feel like if now is eternity and we're all here, there's a certain number of people at higher states of consciousness, and they exist in a different world because they're relating and communicating in a different way. They might actually occupy the same physical space, but other people at lower levels of consciousness are never going to come into communication with them because they don't resonate with that. So in a way, there are different worlds even though it's the same space-time. And our own world is within our consciousness, and our consciousness has to be in that particular level of consciousness in order to interact with those people at that level. So in a way, going into map consciousness and higher levels, one is seeing and interacting at a different level, which seems like a future world, but it's actually a world that's happening now. It's just that our consciousness level isn't at the point where we're unfolding and experiencing that reality as now for us. So it's future for us, but that actual reality is reality for some people. And so then we fall down to prior levels of consciousness. Sometimes the momentum of the fall makes us dip into lower levels, ones that we don't necessarily occupy on a daily basis. But it definitely recalibrates us to the fact of the existence of those levels. And it shows us what happens when we exist in those levels of consciousness. And part of our prevailing level of consciousness is actually our family, our friends, our whole life. So that's why being at higher levels and then coming back down to one's life situation and no longer operating in that higher reality, that other reality, it feels like death. And it also feels awful, and it also feels like a hangover. Coming back to one's regular monotonous life is like a hangover. And then a lot of us, once we've gone to those other realities in consciousness, same place and time, it's just a different level of consciousness. When we come back to this level of consciousness, this stuff seems pretty meaningless and crappy. And so it's difficult to actually get back into it. So it's difficult for people to recover back into buying into the crap that they used to buy into, because at higher levels of consciousness, that crap is no longer has any value. So since we come back down, we still have that sense that this has no value. But at the same time, we're in a reality that values that, and then is trying to get us to recover back into valuing that which we temporarily transcended. And so it's again important to design one's life to end the trance of being stuck in this level of consciousness. And it's also the morphogenetic field of the society that one lives in, because that level of, there's a certain level of consciousness that created this society. And so when we go off into map consciousness, we're no longer participating in the reality that we've created for ourselves, the mechanical, habitual one. We feel free, and we feel like we're in this free reality because our consciousness is free. But then we fall back down into the prevailing level of consciousness. But it still did something. A change in consciousness is probably one of the only actions, because a change in consciousness in one affects the consciousness of the many, because it's all one consciousness being filtered through us as bodies. We're like filters of consciousness, and our brain filters consciousness through our thoughts. But if we are not blinded by our thoughts, then we actually can see clearly. And when we can see clearly, we learn. And when we learn, our consciousness level goes up. If we're seeing the same thing all the time, we're stuck in the same level of consciousness. So I also liked his spoken word thing, because it shows that he has a gift, he has talents. He's using language in a different way. He's using it in a creative way. He's become a bipolar poet. He's not repeating linear past memories. He's translating some of his perceptions into transformative communication. And that's part of what we need to learn as transconscious individuals. Well, how do we translate what we see into something that is some form of communication that will allow other people to see the same thing? Not necessarily the same thing, but maybe see that they don't see. So if he can stand there for 3.5 minutes and spout off brilliant poetry, not just saying a few words and repeating them for 3.5 minutes, but actually very creative structures of language, and very intentional, and he had to see that in order to create that to say. So it was a creative perception that created that. So that creative perception might allow others to see that it's a creative perception. Never mind if they can't see exactly what he's saying. Never mind if they can't see the future. They can maybe see that he saw the future. So that maybe makes them see that seeing something else is possible. So there's so many levels to that, and so many layers, and it's pretty beautiful. So it's wonderful that he's able to express things that way, and able to, in order to show his brain hasn't gotten duller, his brain hasn't gotten more defective. If anything, he sees way too much. If he can see the future, he's seeing too much. And it might only be too much because other people don't see it too. And I was thinking about how when people make small talk about the weather, in a way, it's a way for us to talk, showing that we're seeing the same thing at the same time. Like, oh, isn't it rainy today? Yes, it is. Oh, hasn't it been horrible lately? Yes, it has been. So we're seeing the same thing at the same time, and in that way we form a connection. Now, can we take that sort of small talk scenario of seeing the same thing at the same time and apply that to higher levels of perception. Like, can somebody see that somebody might be able to see the future? And if we can see that, then we're not necessarily going to label and pathologize that person, because we might say, well, I can't right now, but I can see that others might be able to. It makes sense. I can understand that. So seeing is the only action, the act of perception. If we don't see something, we can't act on it. And perception acts on the brain. And if something doesn't act on our brain, it's not acting on us at all. So in terms of saying things that are out there because he said he can see the future, well, I've seen the future too. I kind of forget, and that's part of seeing the future is forgetting about it, because if you're seeing it all the time, well, then it's difficult to operate. And if you see the future and then you try and make it something to memorize, well, then you're making it into a pattern, and then you're back in ego consciousness. So perception might be in the moment now, it might be something seemingly futuristic. It's important to forget all of them, because as soon as you cling to something, there's a stuckness. It's clinging to the ego. The very act of clinging creates the ego. The clinger is what is clung to. So I feel bipolar is actually learning to walk in both worlds. The world of thought, the world of consciousness filtered through thought, and the world of consciousness, sensitivity of direct perception and action. There's the world that thought creates, which is the prevailing level of consciousness. And then there's the world that consciousness creates through direct perception. If we were to directly perceive now and into infinity, we would all work together like ants and create something different. And that would be sort of the gravity of what he was talking about, pulling us all together as one. To be one, we need to be cooperating. To be one consciousness. It's sort of like when the field of consciousness meets the field of gravity, without being warped by thought, without being warped by sound. It's actually this warping, this sound barrier of the ego that makes us feel like we're separate. It makes us feel like we're separate things, because it's judging things instead of observing things. And thought is a distortion of the past. I feel like map consciousness is actually shedding of the past. It's brain molting. I feel like there actually is a metamorphosis in the brain, a mutation, and part of the brain actually molts. Or it could melt and become more fluid. Because the brain is made out of fat and it's very fluid, and it could just be a change in fluidity of the brain cell membranes and the brain cells themselves. And when it is fluid like that, it actually molds. So the ego dying process, when it feels like we're dying, we're actually experiencing a rehardening of the brain, and the ego structures are coming back into play, and we realize that we're going back into prison. And again, people with map consciousness are gifted people. We're just getting acquainted with our gifts as we learn to walk in both worlds. Yesterday I was feeling tired, and I was feeling tired for a few days, and I figured that maybe if I watch a few hours of TV, it'll give my brain a chance to be in passive mode and to rest up a little bit. Being in trance consciousness, in sensitive perception, the brain gets tired. And I was thinking about how normal waking consciousness is like being half asleep. whereas map consciousness is being fully awake. So if I watch TV, that's something that normal consciousness does, and it puts them even more asleep. It's probably like 3/4 asleep, but I feel like it put me half asleep because I was just passively watching this thing in my focal vision. And so it blocks perception, it blocks sensitivity. And so that was almost a way for my brain to sleep for a while, to get some rest. And it totally worked. I was watching this show called The OA on a friend's recommendation, and it's interesting because it's about near-death experiences. And I feel like if near-death experience is replaced by map consciousness or psychosis, they're talking about almost the same thing. Because a person has a death experience, or they actually die and they come back, and they're saying they come back with gifts. And well, a person goes through trance consciousness, they come back with gifts. Just like a person with near-death experience, they come back and they almost died. It takes some time to recover. They probably just don't spring up like, oh, I'm ready to get back to life tomorrow. So in a way, I feel like map consciousness is also a near-death experience. Once one comes out of it, it's just a longer near-death experience, and it's trying to scramble and destroy the ego structures in order for a person to come back to this world and be different in the world. There's a part in the show where she swallows a bird whole, and then that sort of gives her a power when she's in this death experience. And I thought it was interesting because the very first time I was in map consciousness, and I decided to move towards death because I handcuffed myself somewhere so I would stay still, because I thought I was going to jump off the balcony. Interestingly enough, I didn't jump. And when I laid down, the first thing I experienced was being a bird flying south. So it's almost like maybe part of me did jump and became the bird. But since I didn't jump, I became the bird anyway. And I remember actually laying there, and all I could feel was that my mouth was like going like this, and I was actually making a tweeting sound. But I don't know if I just heard that in my mind or if that was coming out of my mouth. But I could feel my mouth moving. So I was this bird flying south, and then my consciousness went into being a homeless person laying on the side of the street. And then I felt this angel trying to take me, and it felt like this big white light. And it felt so warm and loving. And they tried to take me, but I was handcuffed to the balcony. So I remember almost feeling like I was being lifted up, but then it pulled, even though I was still laying there. But I remember feeling that sensation, and then feeling like, oh darn, I have to stay here because I'm handcuffed. And then when my family came in the morning and found me and they flipped me over, I felt like I was dead, but I felt like I was at the scene of a car accident, and I was dying at the scene of a car accident, and they had just come to my side. And I never opened my eyes that whole time. Except for one time when I looked at my arm and I saw blood all over it. But then I just closed my eyes. That was the only time I opened my eyes. And then when they finally grabbed me, Then when the paramedics came, they squashed my finger and I winced. And then I knew I was alive. But I was surprised because when I think about it now, I feel like my consciousness or consciousness left my body for sure. So even though my body was still physically alive, I was kind of technically dead in a way, because it was almost like it was trying to leave my body. It did leave my body. It went to a bird, it went to a homeless person, it went to having wrists that were bleeding or something, I don't know. And it went to being at a scene of a car accident. It went all these places. And then it came back to my body. I'm seeing some stuff that I shouldn't really talk about right now, but there's something around indestructibility. So most of us are communicating from our past. Map consciousness gives us access to future communication, which is seeing the new, which is sort of like seeing the future in a way, because it's something new. It's bringing the new into the present moment as opposed to the old, which is the past. So it's a different movement. Just as gravity is a force that pulls us together, I feel like consciousness is a force that pulls us together too. Our level of consciousness is what pulls whatever into our reality through the resonance of that consciousness. So more and more people resonating at that level is what is going to pull that possible future into the present moment. People are afraid of map consciousness because they're afraid of the power of the human brain. It's very powerful. And I'm wondering, I've read that our ears emit sound. And I wonder if people who go into map consciousness can actually hear this without hearing it, or read that energy as part of being able to read the pattern of somebody. So in that way, it could be one of the ways that we can tell when people are being judgmental and negative, and it makes us feel kind of sick to our stomach. And the power of the human brain requires sensitivity, which requires egolessness. And so these powers of the human brain can't be used for personal gain. They can't be used for evil, because that which is evil is the ego. And if it's there, you can't be that sensitive and you can't be that powerful. So it could perhaps be the only way to power is to selflessly want other people to see their power. Which is their power to see. Which has nothing to do with me and my ego, and nothing to do with the other person and their ego. I feel like the heart can actually pick up on the sound coming out of other people's ears, possibly. So the heart beats, and then the pattern of the sound coming out of the person's ear is picked up by the heart when it pings back. This morning I had to email somebody and I was thinking, oh, I could just leave them a message. But then I realized if I left them a message, they would have to write stuff down. So if I email, then they don't have to write stuff down. And then from there I was imagining, what if we lived in a world where we couldn't write stuff down, or we couldn't put stuff in our calendar, or we couldn't record things in general? In that world, it would be advantageous to be super perceptive and sensitive in the moment, to know how to just act moment to moment. If we couldn't record anything, if we couldn't remember anything beyond our working memory, like the 7 bits of information or something, we would really have to be sensitive and know how to read people. And then you might think, well, you'd have to remember stuff in order to be sensitive to stuff. But it's not necessarily true, because we would evolve the sensitivity of perception and understanding at the same time. Because if I have to remember this detail and that detail and that detail, I'm projecting those details onto the moment, and I'm not actually seeing the moment. So that's the very point where the whole projecting memories onto the moment, it's about judging things in order to act instead of seeing things and acting. If I want to turn on my kettle, I just look at it and press the button. I don't have to judge the kettle in order to understand the kettle. But we project our judgments onto things and then we don't understand it, because a judgment is from the past. So by clogging ourselves up with memories and programs, we've programmed ourselves out of being in touch with the present moment. We're seeing our past knowledge as the 50%. And so mania is an attention to the present moment 100%. And that's why people have a bad memory. I remember actually turning on the kettle and then letting it boil dry because I forgot about it, because I was on to the next thing. I actually like to have things in view. I don't like closed cupboards and things like that, because if I can't see it, I'm not going to remember it, because my brain works more on attention. It sees something and then it knows to do it instead of thinking about what it needs to do. So this morning I was getting ready and then I just looked at my hands. I didn't think I'm going to look at my hands. I just looked at them. And I noticed my nails were long, so I cut them. So when the brain relies on to-do lists and plans and everything, it's so busy looking at its plans, its abstractions about life, that it doesn't see life. And so it relies on plans. So I stopped making to-do lists probably about 6 months ago. I used to have daily to-do. I do have some in my calendar on my computer because I need to at least keep track of appointments and things. And I do have tasks that I need to do. But I used to put things on my to-do list like cut nails. There's quite a few things that I've been able to just export to perception. Just wait until I see it and notice it, and then do it. So when I saw that my nails were long, I could have walked over and put it on a to-do list, cut nails. But I sort of put it in my mind that I'll cut my nails when I'm straightening my hair. And the way I remembered was actually to move my nail clippers from their storage place to on my sink where I get ready. So that way I gave myself a visual reminder of what I needed to do. If I wouldn't have moved that, I might have forgot. This might seem trivial, but when we start to use our visual field to remind us instead of abstract words and computers, then we get our brain more attuned to starting to look into the present moment. But that was like half an hour later. And I didn't forget. And I did cut my nails. But if I would have forgotten, I would have seen it again some other time. So things that we can see, we don't necessarily have to put on to-do lists. That's one way to untrain the brain from to-do lists, is to actually leave some things up to perception to notice physically.